Recently, quite a few viewers have been leaving messages backstage, saying, "Talk about Singapore. What's going on with it lately? Why does it feel like it's having a midlife crisis, either wearing a resentful face, or speaking in that passive-aggressive, sarcastic tone?" Honestly, the reason is actually very simple. Over this recent period, Singaporeans have genuinely been breaking out in cold sweat. To what extent? I've noticed two particularly interesting things recently. The first, an Indonesian ship was originally planning to sail to Singapore, but as soon as the captain heard that Hainan Island would officially begin its closed port operations on December 18th, he made an on-the-spot decision: turn around, skip Singapore, and head straight to Hainan instead. The second, on December 18th, the very day Hainan was officially sealed off, cargo transshipment volumes at Singapore's freight ports showed a clear drop that same day. If you really want to understand the current mindset of Singaporeans, just take a look at their recent media coverage. It's dripping with sarcasm and double talk. Not long ago, someone came forward claiming that back in World War II, there was really no need to keep dwelling on Japan's actions. Look at Southeast Asian countries, we've long since put that behind us. That same person also said, we should stop pursuing Sine Takaichi and just let her off the hook. That stance was so skewed it was almost ridiculous. He completely forgot that the Japanese carried out large-scale massacres in Singapore back then. What happened next was even more awkward. A number of Southeast Asian countries stood up and said, "Only you Singaporeans have forgotten that we haven't." And then, on December 18th, Hainan officially entered closed port operations. That same person came out again and announced, from the 20th until the end of the year, he would be on leave, with the Deputy Prime Minister handling affairs in the meantime. After that, on social media, he used a relaxed, almost casual tone saying, "See you all in 2026. But here's the problem: he wasn't relaxed at all. Not long afterward, he switched to a rather melancholic tone and said, "Small countries have no bargaining power." That person is none other than Singapore's fourth Prime Minister Lawrence Wong. At this point, many people will naturally ask, what exactly have Singaporeans been up to lately? Today, let's take this opportunity to talk it through properly. What kind of country is Singapore really? Let's start with a legend. Around the 11th century, during China's Song dynasty, there was a prince, likely from what is now Indonesia. He sailed across the Strait of Malacca and passed by a small island. The moment he landed, he saw a wild beast he had never encountered before. Startled, he asked his attendants, "Do you know what this creature is?" One of the more knowledgeable attendants replied, "It's a lion." The prince said, "Got it. Then let's call this place Lion." At the time, Sanskrit was very popular among the Indonesian elite. It was somewhat like the opening of War and Peace, a group of Russian aristocrats at a party, all speaking French instead of Russian. The prince was also familiar with Sanskrit, so he used the word Singa, which means lion in Sanskrit. That's how Singapore's national symbol, the merlion, came to be. Later, a small town was built there, and the Sanskrit word Pura, meaning city, was added. And thus, the name Singapore was born. What happened next? As we've mentioned before, at least since the Tang and Song dynasties, large Chinese seagoing vessels had essentially dominated the East China Sea, the Yellow Sea, and the South China Sea. Southward, they could reach Australia. Westward, at least East Africa and the Arabian Sea. For example, archaeological evidence now shows that Guadalcanal, where Japan and the United States fought fiercely during the Pacific War, is already very close to Australia. Yet Chinese sailors had reached that area long before. As for Africa, there's no need to elaborate. Whether heading to Africa, India, or the Middle East, passing through the Strait of Malacca was the optimal route, and the only optimal route. Why? Because Singapore sits at 1.35 degrees north latitude, almost exactly on the equator. Here we need to introduce a concept, the equatorial calm belt. Between 5 degrees north and south latitude lies a zone that is hot and rainy, but almost free of typhoons. Other tropical regions are frequently battered by typhoons, with strong winds and rough seas. The equatorial calm belt is the opposite. As early as the Tang Dynasty, China already had a maritime Silk Road. So what kind of industries are best suited to develop in such a place? Usually two. First, as a service station, allowing sailors battered by storms and rough seas to come ashore, rest, eat a decent meal, sleep well, recover, and then continue their voyage. Second, as a toll station. But this toll station could operate in different ways. Around the 1330s, a Chinese merchant who loved to write Wang Dayuan visited Singapore. He personally witnessed how locals collected tolls. He wrote that the place had no real products, barren land, couldn't even grow rice, and that its economy largely relied on robbery. But even robbery was done with a system. Ships heading from China to India, the Middle East, or East Africa were left alone. They specifically targeted ships returning to China after completing trade and making money. The organization was also interesting, mainly local natives, but mixed with quite a few Chinese, likely the ones providing strategic advice. As for the other toll station model, we'll get to that later. Interestingly, Wang Dayuan didn't call the place Lion City, instead he used the names. One, likely coined by Chinese sailors, was Long Yemen, Dragon Tooth Gate. Very Chinese. The other, probably the local self-designation, was Temasek. Does that ring a bell? Singapore's sovereign wealth fund is called Temasek. That's right, the name comes directly from Wang Dayuan's records. So in a certain sense, this place really does count as something Chinese sailors had since ancient times. Of course, those Chinese people Wang Dayuan encountered were, in all likelihood, later assimilated. At this point, many people might wonder, such a globally critical transportation choke point during the age of exploration, how could it possibly escape the British habit of grabbing every strategic node they saw? The answer, of course, is it couldn't. So Singapore was first eyed by the Portuguese, later meddled with by the French, and finally seized outright by the British in 1824. The man who carried out the takeover was Stamford Raffles. But here's the issue. The evaluation of this man differs enormously between us and Singaporeans. And this difference, to a certain extent, also explains why Singapore's public discourse has recently been so sarcastic toward us. From our perspective, Raffles is easy to define. A colonial pioneer, a full-fledged invader, someone who deserves to be nailed to the pillar of historical shame. But in Singapore, they regard him as a founding father. Not only that, they erected two statues of him in prominent locations around the city. The evaluation is extremely high. Why? Because Raffles introduced Singapore's second toll station model, the Free Port. And not just any free port, a zero-tariff free port. With that single move, Singapore's economy was immediately revitalized. To be fair, the early prosperity doesn't sound particularly flattering, because what flourished first were mostly gray industries. Casinos, the slave trade, and the sex industry. All one can say is, everyone has a past they're not too proud to talk about. But the result was this: very quickly, large numbers of people began flooding into Singapore. Chinese descended groups from what is now Malaysia, such as the Boba and Peranakan, Indians, even Arabs. Only later came the large-scale influx of full-blooded Chinese migrants from mainland China. The population began to grow explosively. In 1819, there were only 1,000 people. By 1821, 5,000. By 1825, it had surged past 100,000. Pay attention to this timeline. When Singapore's population exceeded 100,000, The Opium War was still a full 15 years away. At that stage, the Chinese population was not yet an absolute majority, roughly on par with the Malay population. The real turning point came soon after. In 1860, the Second Opium War broke out. The Qing government was forced to sign the Convention of Beijing. One clause was especially crucial. Britain and France were allowed to recruit laborers in China, and the Qing government could not obstruct it. And so, Singapore experienced its first true wave of Chinese immigration. By the 1871 census, Chinese had already become the absolute majority. This explains one common perception. Why do so many people's first reaction to Singapore today is, isn't it a Chinese country? The answer is directly tied to the Convention of Beijing. But from this point onward, our historical memories and those of Singaporeans began to diverge sharply. When we think of the Second Opium War, we think of a century of humiliation, Balikiao, and the burning of the old summer palace. Many Singaporeans, however, think, without the Convention of Beijing, our ancestors might never have come to this country at all. By around 1900, Singapore was already quite prosperous, with a population approaching 200,000. After rapid development, disaster followed. During World War II, Japan occupied Singapore for more than 3 years. When the war ended and Singapore returned to British control, the entire city was nearly in ruins. Illegal housing and slums were everywhere. But did it end there? No. Because from the moment Raffles turned Singapore into a zero-tariff port in 1824, the country carried an inherent flaw from birth: a grey economy. In plain terms, gambling, prostitution, and drugs. And what inevitably comes with those: gangs, violence, and high crime rates. Worse still, Singapore is tiny. Even after extensive land reclamation, it's just over 700 square kilometers. You can drive from east to west in under an hour. Extremely high population density, severe lack of natural resources. Even fresh water was in short supply. Life for ordinary people was extremely difficult. That was Singapore in the 1950s. At this point, one piece of bad news and one piece of good news arrived at the same time. The bad news: Britain planned to withdraw, letting Singapore and surrounding colonies become independent. Why was this bad for Singapore? Because with such limited land and so many people, it simply couldn't sustain itself. The good news: the Malaysia that was preparing for independence had big ambitions. They proposed a plan to take over all British colonies in Southeast Asia in one go, including Peninsular Malaysia, Singapore, Sarawak, Sabah, Brunei. But the plan quickly ran into trouble. As Malaysia was lobbying everywhere, news came from Brunei. Large oil fields had been discovered. Daily production was close to 60,000 barrels, fifth in the world at the time. Malaysia immediately opened talks. If you join us, we'll let you keep your oil revenues. Brunei asked one question: for how long? Malaysia hedged: don't worry about how long, we promise to keep it. Brunei immediately understood that promise wasn't worth much. Keep it today, flip tomorrow, a familiar routine. So Brunei refused outright. No joining, we'll be independent. In the end, when Malaysia gained independence in 1963, the actual members were Peninsular Malaysia, Sabah, Sarawak, and Singapore. This moment was crucial, because next, the man everyone knows, the one with a built-in protagonist halo, officially entered the stage: Lee Kuan Yew. Lee Kuan Yew's story is familiar to many. Born in Singapore in 1923, he excelled academically, first studying at the London School of Economics, then at Cambridge University. He returned to Singapore in 1950 to work as a lawyer. In 1954, he entered politics and founded the People's Action Party. In 1959, Singapore became a self-governing state under British rule. and Lee Kuan Yew was elected Prime Minister. In 1963, Malaysia officially gained independence. Lee brought Singapore into Malaysia together with it. These points later became the standard narrative of the protagonist halo version of history. But the real history was far more complicated. First, there was his British background. Think about it. Someone who had not lived locally for a long time returned to Singapore and, in less than 4 years, formed a political party. Then in under 5 more years, became Prime Minister. Was this really just a grassroots miracle? Then came a fatal mistake. After Singapore joined Malaysia, Lee Kuan Yew began frequently shouting a slogan, "Malaysia belongs to all Malaysians." The moment this slogan was voiced, the Malay population in Malaysia exploded in anger. At the time, Malaysia's demographic structure was roughly Malays, about 40%, Chinese, about 40%, indigenous peoples and others, under 20%. The Malays had always hoped for Malay supremacy. But under Lee Kuan Yew's slogan, if the Chinese allied with other ethnic groups, the Malays would instantly lose political dominance. Malaysia's Prime Minister at the time, the founding father of the nation, Tunku Abdul Rahman, immediately realized something critical. This wasn't an ideological disagreement, it was a direct threat to political power. So Malaysia adopted an extreme but highly effective solution. Amend the constitution. Hold an emergency vote. The result, 126 votes in favor, 0 against. Singapore was expelled outright. Thus, Singapore became one of the rare countries in the world to be forced into independence. The date was August 9, 1965. Later, Lee Kuan Yew recalled the moment with intense emotion, saying, "Singapore's independence was imposed upon us. We never fought for independence." He also said, in his entire life, he cried only twice. Once, when his mother passed away, and once, when Singapore was forced to become independent. That day made front-page headlines around the world. For example, the Straits Times ran the headline, "Singapore is out." And here comes the real question. A country with no resources, no hinterland, not even enough fresh water. After being kicked out like that, how did Singapore survive? Many people say, because of Lee Kuan Yew's protagonist halo. He appeared out of nowhere, pulled off one brilliant move after another, and single-handedly saved Singapore. That's partly true, but a large part of it isn't, right? A story repeatedly beautified and packaged after Singapore succeeded. Take this example. During Singapore's most dangerous years, the country that truly saved it was not someone else, but its former colonial master Britain. At the time, Britain still maintained a massive military presence in Singapore. Sometimes 30,000 troops, sometimes 50,000, depending on the situation. These troops had to eat, drink, live, and spend money. They also needed entertainment. As for whether that entertainment was great, we won't go into details here. Moreover, many British soldiers were stationed with their families. Back then, Britain's per capita GDP was around 1,850 United States dollars. Military salaries were even higher. More importantly, the British had little habit of saving money. Originally, Britain planned to fully withdraw from Singapore around 1967, but Lee Kuan Yew personally stepped in, using both hard and soft tactics. His goal was simple. No matter what, the British had to stay a few more years. What was the hard approach? If you withdraw, we'll stop settling trade in pounds sterling and switch to US dollars. Singapore was a critical port. Britain cared about that deeply. And the soft approach. If you stay a few more years, you can still maintain influence in Southeast Asia. The result? Britain agreed. The withdrawal was delayed until 1971. What did this mean for Singapore? It meant a buffer for survival. The presence of British troops, through consumption of food, housing, services, and entertainment, directly contributed about 20% of Singapore's GDP. Without this support, after being expelled from Malaysia in 1965, Singapore would have been very likely to collapse on the spot. But this chapter of history is not something the Singaporean authorities like to emphasize. And yet, it reveals a deeper truth. Regardless of right or wrong, many of their core perceptions are genuinely different from ours. Then, luck struck again. During this same period, an economic backup plan Lee Kuan Yew had laid years earlier began to take effect. That plan was the Economic Development Board. It was established in 1961, when Singapore was still a British self-governing state. At first glance, many people assume it's like a National Development Commission. It's not that, it's more like a global investment promotion agency. It had only one mission: travel the world, find companies, and persuade them to invest and build factories in Singapore. Writing letters, making calls, visiting in person, negotiating one company at a time. The core pitch was simple: great location, large port, flexible policies. Come build your factory here, and the government will fully support you. How? 2 points. First, tax incentives. Second, lightning-fast administration. Procedures were simplified wherever possible. Even today, many Singaporeans still say, "This was how we made it through the crisis." But the truth is not entirely. The real key variable was something else. 2 words: the Vietnam War. Singapore hit an unbelievable stroke of luck. In the very year it was expelled from Malaysia, the United States massively escalated the Vietnam War. In February 1965, bombing of North Vietnam began. In March, U.S. Marines landed in Vietnam. By the end of the year, U.S. troops in South Vietnam had reached 150,000. By 1969, combined U.S. and South Vietnamese forces exceeded 2 million. What does that mean? It means enormous energy demand. Cars, aircraft, warships, armored vehicles, all massive fuel consumers. So what happened? Singapore had been promoting investment since 1961, with mediocre results. But starting in 1965, foreign capital suddenly poured in, especially oil refining. Why? Because Singapore was a transportation hub. Crude oil could be shipped in easily. Once refined, it could be sent straight to the Vietnam front, saving money, time, and effort. In those years, Singapore made a killing. From 1965 to 1969, oil refining capacity surged by 495%. Exports of petroleum products jumped by 742%. Ship repair also boomed. Warships damaged in Vietnam were towed directly to Singapore for repairs. Other industries took off across the board. In just 5 years, Singapore's per capita GDP rose from $516 to $956. This once again proves a simple truth. There is no such thing as a protagonist halo falling from the sky. What exists are opportunities, and an old saying, "A horse grows fat on night grass." Singapore in the 1970s profiting from war was the most lucrative business of all. But do you think that was the end of it? No. Another wave of luck arrived even bigger than war profits. That was the container revolution. We previously discussed how containers transformed Japan's economy. Around 1965, Japan was already enjoying war dividends from the Korean and Vietnam Wars, growing rapidly. By conventional logic, problems should have emerged, but they didn't. Instead, Japan kept growing, and by 1967 had even surpassed Germany. The reason lay in containers. Before 1965, global industrial production was highly fragmented, mostly confined within 25 miles of ports. Transportation was extremely cumbersome. In the 1960s, driven by the Vietnam War, containerization took off, instantly breaking the 25-mile limitation. Japan's economy had been like someone trapped in a small cave, running out of oxygen. Suddenly, the cave collapsed, revealing an entirely new world. And Singapore, similar but with a different form, and with even greater advantages. Remember how we described Singapore earlier, like a toll station on a highway, plus a service area. If the US was fighting wars in Asia, huge amounts of supplies had to pass through Singapore. If Britain wanted to maintain regional influence, stationing troops there made perfect sense. That spending couldn't be avoided. Next, China, Japan, and South Korea in East Asia, on their way to Europe, the Middle East, and Africa, all had to pass through the Strait of Malacca, and Singapore guarded that choke point. Your ship passes by, you need fuel, supplies, repairs. That was the first stage. Then around 1965, the second stage began. Because of containerization, many small, fragmented goods that were previously impossible to export suddenly became tradable. Container ships in the 1970s didn't carry as many boxes as today. Take an example. Indonesia wants to sell 50 tons of palm oil to Europe. The volume is too small, shipping it alone isn't cost-effective. Singapore says, ship it to us first. We'll combine it with Vietnamese oil, Chinese goods, and other cargo, fill a massive ship of hundreds of thousands of tons, and send it to Europe together. The same worked in reverse. Goods from around the world arrived in Singapore, were split, reassembled, and redistributed across Asia. Money was made on the way in and on the way out. How big was this business? Last year, 380 billion United States dollars. That's 70% of Singapore's GDP. Of that, 200 billion United States dollars was destined for us. Plucking feathers from passing geese. Just think how much Singapore earns from that. Singapore's port. Then came the third stage. As Asia's economy, especially ours, rose, Singapore, acting as Asia's logistics steward, branched into new areas. Companies coming and going need capital. Banking rose. So many ships, high risk. Insurance rose. Frequent cargo flows need price hedging. Futures trading rose. How much does this generate? Last year, 65.421 billion United States dollars, 13.4% of GDP. Averaged out, that's roughly 10,000 United States dollars per person. So you see, detouring cargo earns money. Then finance built on that detour earns even more. And the more our economy grows, the more Singapore profits. Last year, its per capita GDP reached a staggering figure, 90,000 United States dollars. But here's the issue. An increasing portion of this wealth comes at the cost of our efficiency losses. So if you were Singaporean, you'd obviously want this arrangement to continue. What about us? Of course we want unnecessary waste to keep shrinking. Singapore exchange, but do Singaporeans want that? They don't, and they're extremely sensitive about it. On September 23rd this year, a container ship named Istanbul Bridge set sail from Ningbo port. Instead of heading for the Strait of Malacca, it went north, crossed the Bering Strait, and traveled west along Russia's Northern Sea route. 18 days later, it arrived at Felixstowe port in the UK. On October 3rd, Singaporean media began making sarcastic remarks, claiming the Arctic route was unsafe, environmentally unfriendly, and unused. They also said global shipping giants like Maersk and CMA Mad pledged to stay away from the Arctic route. Why is this sarcastic? Maersk is Danish. Denmark is sanctioning Russia. Most of the Arctic route passes through Russian territorial waters. Do you really think Maersk dares to sail there? What if Russia detains the ship? CMA is the same, it's French. So these comments are essentially meaningless. Isn't the real issue simply this? The Arctic route doesn't go through the Strait of Malacca. It's cheaper, faster. What's wrong with that? Why should we spend more time and money just so you can profit? This also explains Around the time Hainan announced its closed port policy, Singapore kept producing cold remarks and snide comments, because the impact of Hainan is even greater than the Arctic route. Of course, compared with Singapore, which has refined intraport trade and finance for decades, Hainan still has a long way to go. But here's the key: Hainan's policies are even tougher. First, at Yangpu Port, as long as bulk cargo is consolidated into full shiploads, it's zero tariff, because Hainan is now sealed off. As mentioned earlier, last year alone, Singapore earned $200 billion from this kind of consolidation trade with us. That money will be very hard for it to earn in the future. And cargo from other countries that used to be consolidated in Singapore is also likely to gradually shift here. We can't say exactly how much, but it won't be small. Second, behind Hainan stands our country, the world's most complete industrial supply chain, the world's largest cargo volume, and more importantly, tax rates. Singapore's corporate income tax is 17%, already quite low. Hainan offers 15%. Personal income tax is also capped at 15%. And this is just the beginning. As we discussed earlier, Singapore itself followed this path. Start with logistics consolidation, reach scale, then pivot to finance. And once it pivoted, financial income reached $10,000 per capita. So if Hainan gets logistics right, transitioning to finance in the future will be entirely natural. So how should we view all this? Simply put, a country's rise has historical reasons. But if you cling to those reasons and refuse to adapt, that's your own problem. Your per capita GDP is already $90,000, yet you still expect us to keep conceding benefits. When we don't, you start making snide remarks. Frankly, that image doesn't look good. Besides, Singaporeans themselves often emphasize, we are not a Chinese country. We are a multiracial country. Chinese just happen to be the majority. If you don't understand this, you can't be considered Singaporean. In other words, Singapore doesn't even acknowledge a we're brothers relationship. That said, even brothers settle accounts clearly, let alone the fact that you've aligned with Britain and the US for decades. We never even spoke harshly, and still let you earn money for so many years. Honestly, that's already more than fair. Now your per capita GDP is $90,000, while we still have a huge population to support. This kind of emotional breakdown serves no purpose. It's better to think abutho to improve yourself in a changing era. We understand this much. Your historical experiences and psychological perceptions are indeed different from ours. But no matter what, there's no need to lose composure. If business can be done, basic goodwill should remain, especially since in the future, there's still ample room for mutual upgrading and win-win cooperation.